So it's my big pleasure to welcome ter Heerdt. I hope I said that kind of close. And Jay works for Microsoft. He's a product manager working for Microsoft in Power BI itself. So it's a pleasure for us to be hearing directly from the Microsoft team. And if we treat Jay well, we might just get our requests put in Power BI for the next 2 or 3 months. So well, let's not ask him hard questions. So we are in a bit of a schedule today. So without further ado, I'll hand over to Jay. Take it away.
Well, thank you, Martin. Thanks, first of all, for having me. And I hope with all the schedule issues you had, that actually the pizza kind of worked out. So it's almost lunchtime around here. So I'm Jay, or officially I'm called Jeroen, but I go by Jay because my parents gave me a very Dutch weird name that nobody understands and nobody knows how to pronounce. So just feel free to just call me Jay. I'm not sure how we're going to do that with the questions, but we'll figure it out as we go. So I work as a product manager on the Power BI team, and I own the DAX language, the language that everybody loves to hate. So that's kind of what I do and what I work on. And we've been working on something very cool for the last almost 3 years now, I think. I think the first update we gave to management was from July 2021. And then we started thinking about that long before that. So yeah, this has been a long time in the making, and I'm excited to talk about what we've been up to for all these years to you all today. And yeah, let's just get in. I'll start with sharing my screen. Now, if there's any questions or anything goes wrong, I do see the camera feed. So Martin, if you can basically raise your hand if there's a question or whatever, so then I can kind of interact that way. Okay.
Perfect, will do.
All right, cool. So I'm sharing my screen. You should see a PowerPoint coming up. Okay. So we're talking about making DAX easier, right? So just as a quick introduction, again, like if you want to reach out to me later on socials or whatever, you need my email address or find me on LinkedIn or any of the social media that are popular. Here's the stuff that you need to know. So feel free to send me an email anytime you need me. Always happy to talk. So normally, if this was a virtual call where we would all be in Teams, I would be asking you to raise your hand if you ever had any issues working with DAX. Maybe we can try that as well. I can see part of the room. So please raise your hand if you've ever had any trouble working with DAX before. Have you ever felt like this is really hard to do? Yeah, exactly.
Jay, I'm sorry to say, but all the hands are up. All the hands.
Yeah, exactly. So I see some of the hands going up in the small sliver of the screen that I see, and that's normal, right? That is exactly what's happening. It's not normal, but it's essentially all over the place for all of our customers. Everyone in our community has struggled with DAX. And it's really a testament to the quality of the rest of the product, if you think about it, that we got this far to our leadership position in like basically a data analysis tool and a self-service BI tool, with our core programming language being so hard, clearly so hard for our users. It's really interesting if you think about it like that we came that far with DAX being so hard. So let's just talk about the reality today, right? This is how most of us write DAX. Like you copy paste and you cross your fingers. And maybe if you're so inclined, you, I don't know, say something to some DD or whatever. It's not required, it's totally optional. But hey, some feel this helps. But this is what you do. You find something and you copy paste. And you might find it online on our community website, on some blog from some community member, maybe an MVP, maybe an official Microsoft forum or our documentation page, or you might actually read one of these, the famous books from the experts. You might read those and have them under your pillow. I always have them close by. I'm not sure what that means. Sorry?
There's people cheering to the books. I'm not sure if they've read them all.
So, I have them here and I read all of them. Did I all understand all of these fully? No. Let's just be honest. Anyway, so that's where you get your information. You find the stuff there somehow, and you type it over, you copy paste, and then you hope and cross your fingers that it will actually work. And this is really a problem, because you don't necessarily, you have to be a DAX expert to really validate that the result of this DAX that you just pasted in will always be the right results for you. So how do you even validate that? So that's a challenge as well. So, and then just to give you an example, things that are perceived as very simple are very hard to do in DAX. Like anything that goes back to referring to whatever came before me in the calculation is very hard to do in DAX, which leads to something that is pretty astounding to many managers and many users that are just getting started. And that is doing a running total. A running total, just as an example, a running total is very simple. You can do that if you have a basic understanding of math. All you need is a pen and paper, a bunch of numbers, and the ability to add those numbers. That's all you need to do a running total, right? A running sum or running total. They're the same thing, right? You can write it down. Anybody with basic understanding of math can do this. In Excel, it's just drag and drop, and you can just write it out. Great. Have you ever tried to do a running sum or running total in DAX? Have you ever tried that? Any idea on how many steps that would take? So if you start searching for this, very quickly, you'll find this website or this search result, and it lists 21 steps to doing a running total in DAX. 21. Let that sink in. We're not talking about rocket science here. We're talking about basic math. 21 steps. You see why that's a problem? This should not be that hard. It is 20 steps too many, if you ask me. So we should change the way DAX works and try to figure out a way to make DAX easier for the rest of us. So you don't have to read all those books and go through all the training. What can we do to make DAX easier? So really, that's our challenge that we have. So let's face it, in summary, DAX is hard. If you start thinking about that a little bit more deeply, it turns out that it's about the filter context. The filter context, which dictates how a DAX statement is being evaluated, in which context it's being evaluated, and hence which result it returns, is really hard to grasp. We don't do a good job of visualizing that for you. We don't explain it to you. It's really black magic. You need to be aware of all the things happening in the model for you to even get a grasp of what that DAX statement is going to return. And then DAX calculations, specifically the measures that you create, are scoped to the model. So they live inside of the model. So they have to deal with all of that filter context. And then typically business type calculations are really hard to do because there's really no good way to refer to what's coming next or what came before me in the calculation. And then, of course, we have quick measures, which allow you to generate DAX for a business type calculation like a running sum. It can spit out DAX, but the DAX it generates is so horrible that it's still hard to comprehend. It is still hard to edit. It's still hard to validate. So it's really not a solution because there's zero guarantee that you can actually validate that result and make sure that it will return the running total that you expected in all the situations you might be using it in. Okay, so that's the challenge. So what if we could do something else? And what if we turned this whole thing upside down? What if we said, we're going to give you another way of doing calculations? And for that, to understand why you arrived at this conclusion, you need to understand a little bit more about how DAX works or how the engine of Power BI works. So think about Power BI as a pipeline. You put raw data in, you go through some data transformation steps, Power Query and stuff, right? And then in the end, there's visuals. Right? It's very tempting to jump from raw data to visuals, but you need to do a lot of work before you end up with a good visual. And one of those steps in between is a model. And one of the other steps is adding calculations like a measure or a calculated column. Now, those things, a measure and calculated column, they sit almost at the beginning of the pipeline. You have the raw data, you cleaned it, right? Then you model it, and that's where you add your measures. So those measures live all the way in front of the pipeline on the unaggregated data after it has been cleaned. So what if, instead of all the way in front of the pipeline, we go to the other end of the pipeline where you create a visual, and we said, here's also an opportunity for you to add a calculation. The benefit of that would be that we would allow you to work with aggregated data, because while the pipeline is progressing towards that visual, one of the things that happens is that visual at some point takes a sliver of the data in the data set, aggregates it to the level it needs to show. For example, if you have a bar chart showing sales for years, the only thing it actually knows, that visual knows, is a amount per year for as many years as you have. So if you have 10 years, you have 10 data points, one for each year. Not millions of records of sales, not important for that visual. The visual just knows sales per year. So what if we allowed you to just do the calculation right there on the visual, working with the aggregated data? And what if, while doing that, we could leave all the complexity of the model behind? You don't have to worry about what they make DAX hard, the filter context. You don't have to worry about the model. You can just look at the aggregated data and go like, yeah, I understand this. I know what I can work with. That's the only thing I have to worry about. You get blinders on, basically, and then that makes life easier, right? And then maybe, what if you didn't like typing, or what if you really didn't understand DAX and you would really like to do some point and click, much like Excel gestures, instead of just typing all out the expression and having to know the functions? That would be great, right? So that's where I want to introduce to you visual calculations, or visual calcs for short. And that's the answer to this challenge. Visual calcs are nothing more and nothing less than DAX calculations defined on a visual. So instead of doing that in the model, as you're forced to today with measured and calculated columns, you can now do that on the visual. Obvious benefits would be aggregated data, less complexity to worry about, because you don't have to work about filter context. All of that has already been applied, and you can refer to whatever is on the visual. There's a hard and fast rule here. You can only refer to what's on the visual. It sounds weird because it's limiting, but also think about it. If we allowed you from that calculation in that visual to reach back into the model, you would have to worry about all the complexity that comes with working inside the model with the filter context and everything else. So we basically don't solve the problem. So we gave you a sandbox, if you will, a little box in which the data that's on the visual lives, in which you're going to do your work. You cannot step out of that box. Do you want to add ingredients to the box? Great, add stuff into the box first. You cannot step out of this box. So the visual calculation can only work with a little box that is inside of the visual. But visual calculations have extra tricks. Not only are they way faster, because they work with aggregated data instead of unaggregated data like measures and calc columns, they are like 500% faster. Also, they can refer to the visual structure, because suddenly now we have a calculation that's on a visual that understands that a visual has multiple axes, and y-axis and an x-axis, and maybe, you know, a legend or a small multiple as another, maybe z-axis, if you will. You want to think about it in a three-dimensional space. Suddenly you can refer to that to lead to very flexible calculations, and I'll show you that in a second. And then most of the time you don't have to worry about filter context. I'm not allowed to say you never have to worry about filter context, because, you know, there might be situations in which you shoot yourself in the foot and make it harder than it has to be. So legal wise, I'm only allowed to say most of the time. But honestly, that's going to be like 99% of the time that you don't have to worry about the complexity of the whole model. So now you might sit here and go like, well, wait, what are you doing? Well, we're now basically giving you another option in doing calculations. And I'm not sure, I don't see the screen updating on your side. Are you still seeing the visual calculations page or no?
Now we're seeing the calculated column, measure, and visual calculations.
Great, then the video feed is just frozen. Okay, great. Thank you for confirming.
No problem.
So yeah, so we're looking at the slide that shows visual calcs versus measures versus calc columns. So the measures here is we're not taking anything away. Calc columns are still here, measures are still here, visual calculations are now a new kid on the block that you can use. I fully expect that most people actually will want to use visual calculations in the long run. It will take some getting used to, but they're easier to write, easier to edit, easier to read. So there's benefits there in terms of like usability. They're faster, way faster than anything else. And there's only a few situations in which you really need to write a measure or a calc column that's when you have to rely on the model to do dynamic things, for example, by walking a relationship between tables. Because remember, the Visual Calc is only a little box, so it has no notion of the model with separate tables. So if you need that kind of capability, yes, you will have to use a calc column or a measure. But for many cases, Visual Calcs are going to be your new best friend that are actually easier and faster to use. So visual calculations are WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get, right? So you'll be very visually seeing the calculation happening, so you can easily validate the DAX that you wrote. Point and click will be provided if you want, so you don't have to type all the time. We are just starting on this journey, so that don't expect me to now show you a fully mouse-driven interface. That is not what I'm going to show you in a second. And then you work within this little sandbox, so there's less stuff to worry about. And then we'll introduce the capability to refer to the visual structure, and we'll introduce functions for common business type calculations. Okay, so before we go to the demo, I want to show you one more slide, which is actually the most important slide in the whole slide deck, because this is the pivotal mental model that you need to understand to be successful with visual calculations. And that is that any visual can be represented as a matrix. Any visual. Doesn't matter if it's a map, a bar chart, a pie chart, whatever. If it has small multiples or things on the legend, it doesn't matter. You can always show that thing in a matrix format. And that's the core principle that I want you to have. So when you start working with visual calcs, what we'll show you is the visual that you're working on. And then what we call the visual matrix on the bottom of the screen. So you'll see the visual on the top, the visual matrix on the bottom, and these two are linked. So the visual matrix shows the data that you see in the visual, right? So these two are linked, and they work together. And then you define your calculations on the visual matrix. So you have a formula bar where you can start typing. You'll see the mock-up over here. You see the visual on top and the visual matrix at the bottom. And then this is aggregated data. As I already said, in this visual, the only thing that this exact visual that I have here as a mock-up on the screen needs is 3 rows and 3 columns, because it's showing numerical values for 3 years. It is showing sales amount, the total product cost for FY 2018, 2019, and 2020. So really what it needs is 3 columns and 3 years. 1 column for year, with 3 words in there, FY 2018, 19, 2020, and then 2 more columns for numerical values. 1 for sales amount, 1 value for each year, and 1 for total product cost, 1 value for each year. That's all this visual knows. That's all this visual needs to paint itself onto the screen. This might be aggregated data based on millions of sales records. Doesn't matter at this point. You're not interested in those. The visual is not interested in those. This is what you're painting onto the screen. And on here, you can now do calculations. So you don't have to worry about these many millions rows. You just work with the 6 numbers that are here on your screen to do your calculations with. And then you can then define calculations on top of other fields in the visual as well as other visual calcs. So I'll just show you a demo. Before I jump into the demo, I need you to confirm that you can actually see my my Power BI desktop, because otherwise the demo would kind of fall flat, because I'm still looking at a frozen video. So
yeah, I think that froze, but yeah, we can see your Power BI desktop.
Great, cool. Okay, so let's get into the demo. So this is not fake. We're literally looking at Power BI desktop. This is a build that will be in your hands very, very soon. I'm not at liberty to give you the exact timelines, but stay tuned. I'm not pulling your leg. This is not fake. This is in the product. Okay, so I'm showing you a live demo in the product. Okay, so I'll just use the classic AdventureWorks that we all know, and I'm just going to build a very simple visual. Going to take the sales amount and total product cost, and I'm going to do that by let's do fiscal year, and yeah, that's good enough for now. You can always make a more complicated visual later. Okay, so I have a very simple visual. I'm just going to sort that by fiscal year, so we actually have the oldest fiscal year on the top, and then we can see, you know, FY 2018, 2019, 2020, right? Makes sense. I'll zoom in so you can see the visual a little bit better. Okay, so this is the visual. Nothing special, nothing magic around here. It's just very simple visual. Okay. So now what I can do is once I have that visual selected, I can use this new button over here that shows up, which is not enabled if I don't have a visual selected. It's disabled. And that's the new calculation button. And if I click that, I'll be dropped in what I just showed you on the screen, on the mockup in PowerPoint. I'll actually be dropped in what we call the visual calcs edit mode. Okay, so this is the visual calculations edit mode. It's not different from the mockup that I showed you. Let me just make some more room over here. There we go. So I see the visual on top, I see the formula bar, and then I see the visual matrix, right? And you can do the math. You can check that these numbers are correct, right? You can see that this bar for 2020 sales amount is 51 million and something, and that is exactly that number that shows up here. Now, important to note, we also show you the total. It's not shown on the visual, but just because this is a matrix at the bottom, we can show you the total, which would allow you to do very interesting calculations against the total, for example. Okay, great. Then also what you see here is the visual matrix already has a placeholder calculation for me. So it's very inviting for me to start typing or adding a calculation. Now, let me just add some stuff. I'll start with very simple stuff that arguably should have been a measure, but fine, just to lead you into this idea. Okay, so we have sales amount, we have total product cost. So I'm just going to add something that I call profit. I'm just going to say sales amount minus total product cost. Now, before I press commit, a couple things to note here. I'm not referring to the table because I don't have to, right? These columns, sales amount and total product cost, could have come from two different tables or two different measures somewhere. Doesn't matter. They're just on the visual. Whatever the name is on the visual, that's what I refer to. Okay, so I'm going to add that. Now, what happens here if I do this, for each row in the table, in the visual matrix, this expression will be evaluated. So we'll just basically take each value for each row of sales amount and subtract total product cost and add that as a column over here, right? So you can literally see the difference being taken of each column. Okay, sounds good. Okay, so let's do something more intelligent. Maybe I wanted to compare the profit for each year versus the previous profit. So I'm going to say something like profit versus previous year. Okay, so let's think about that. Okay, I need profit. Okay, great. So it knows that I can refer to profit. So now I need some way to get the profit for the previous year. Any guesses to what the function name would be for getting the profit from the previous year? Maybe
I think people are understanding what you mean by that. Yeah, we know where you're going with that.
So maybe previous, and then take the previous sales amount. And would that work? Well, that works. Of course it works. I wrote this, so of course it works.
There's shock in the room.
That is great. So this is essentially almost as English. Like you can dream up this expression and go like, I understand what this expression does. Previous profit minus previous profit. Very, very simple. Okay, let's do something more intelligent. What if I wanted to add a running sum for profit? Could I do that? Oh, let's try. I can type it. I'll also show you another function. We have a template. So to get you started a little bit, we have stuff that we pre-built to show you around on kind of the cool things that we can do. So we have a moving average, running sum, percent of parent, percent of grandparent, grand total, average of children versus previous. I already used that. Versus first, versus next, versus last. So there's stuff in here. This is just templates. So once you know your way around, you can definitely just type these out. They're not hard, but just to get you started. So template for running sum. Any guesses to what the function name for running sum would be? By now, this should be easy for you all because, you kind of know how my brain works by now. So I'm guessing some of you will think running sum, right? Well, you would be right. It's literally called running sum. This is so easy. I mean, this is just English, right? So running sum of profit. Would this work? Well, of course this works. Wanted to do a moving average of profit? Let's just do a moving average. What would be the function name? Oh, called moving average, of course. And then I need some kind of window size. I have like 3 years. So let me do a window size of 2. So I get a moving average profit over 2 years, right? The sliding window. Great. This is Visual Calcs. This is that easy. It doesn't get any easier than this. Now there's one problem. I kind of screwed up my whole visual, right? I was adding all these calcs. I started with sales amount, total product cost, and now added 4 calcs. And now my visual is horrible, right? You can see all the updates happening over here. This visual looks like nothing, right, that I want. So we need some way to dictate what is shown on the visual while leaving the visual matrix intact. Because if we start removing stuff from the visual matrix, remember, the visual calcs can only refer to what's on the visual matrix. So removing stuff from the visual matrix would break my calculations. So I cannot remove it from the visual matrix. To hammer home that point, if I rename the sales amount on this visual to Martin's sales amount, everything would work because profit is the only one that refers to sales amount. It is now updated to refer to Martin's sales amount. So we're smart about it. But that basically means I cannot get rid of Martin's sales amount because then profit would not work. Hence, everything else would not work because all of that depends on profit, which in itself depends on Martin's sales amount. Okay, so what do I do? Well, here's the trick. We have a little eye icon over here that you might recognize from the model view. And we can now hide stuff from the visual. So let's say I'm only interested in showing the running sum of profit. Maybe the difference in profit, let's do that one. And then I want to show the running sum and the moving average in the tooltips. Okay, so now I have a completely new visual that didn't exist before that shows me the difference in profit for each year compared to the previous year in the visual, and then the running sum and the moving average of the profit in the tooltip. So when I back out, that is the visual that we're going to show you. So
People are gasping.
I do see the video feedback is back up. So yeah, I can see indeed that you're looking at the same screen. Cool. So I will open it up for questions, but not before I showed you this one slide, because if you want to make my day, I would like to ask you a favor. If you are on social media at all, if you want to post something about what I just shown you, saying that what I've shown you is blowing your mind, that would make my day, because there's people over here in Redmond who are tracing this, and if I get a lot of people saying this over on social media, people really like what we're doing. So if you would be so inclined to go on social media now or later, doesn't matter, to just make some post like that, that would be the best payment for me, best reward for me. Okay, so let's see if there's any questions in the room.
All right, there's a few questions. Let me try to hand over the microphone. You gotta tell me if you can hear it okay, Jay, all right?
Yep, sure.
Is it DAX?
Yes, it is DAX. This is not a new language. There's no new language to learn except for new functions. It is just DAX.
Right, so that was an easy question. Let me get you the microphone.
So the previous is just n-1. So what if I want apart from n-1, like a custom statement?
So you wanted to step over some of the years, maybe?
Let's say n-5.
Yeah, sure. That's not a problem at all. We can just do, if my demo allows me to do that. I don't have so many years, so it's not going to be easy to show. But let me just go in here. And I can actually do this. I can do previous, comma, and then n number of steps. Default of steps in previous would be 1, but I can just type 5, and then it would step 5 years back if I had that much data on my visual.
Okay, that's it.
Make sense? I told you, we thought about this long and hard.
Any more questions? One more.
Thanks. Hi, Jay. One of the advantages about using measures is it's calculation defined once and then reused in lots of different places. So
yes,
how does, given that we might have multiple visuals, does that play with defining your calculation once?
So great question. I can't see you on the visuals on the video screen, but it's a great question. So the answer is visual calcs are confined to the visual. So for you to use the same calculation over and over again on the visual, you would have to copy paste them to the visual, which is not great. I recognize that. So there's two alternative ways of working with this that we're thinking about and slowly building towards, which is A, you would be able to promote what we like to think about as promotion, a visual calc to a measure. So you wrote it once for a visual, and then we would basically take that simple visual calcs expression, for example, this, right? Profit minus previous profit, and then give you a way to store that as a measure. Also, with that generating the complicated DAX that we would have to generate for you to write that measure if you would want to write that on your own, right? So we would basically spit out the DAX. You would be more comfortable with that because you know it worked in a visual calc. So you would, be less on your own to validate the DAX. So that would be one way. So promoting visual calcs as measures. The other way we're thinking about is maybe giving you a way to create this visual matrix and reuse that visual matrix across visuals, right? That would then allow you to define the calculation once on the visual matrix and then say, well, this visual matrix is actually being used in many visuals. Right now, there's a one-to-one mapping between the visual and the visual matrix, right? Because they're tied together. But there would be no reason for us to not allow you to say, hey, here's a visual matrix, define my calcs. Oh, I want to reuse the same visual matrix I defined before. Maybe start thinking about this visual matrix as a view on your data model or a calculated table on which you can define then the calculations. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, so it almost becomes like a kind of first-class object in its own right.
Yes.
Very cool.
And it's important to recognize that what I'm showing you today is not in the product yet. You don't have your hands on this. So even when we do, that will not all be there, right? Because we're just starting on this journey. We have a long way to go, but yeah, we're absolutely thinking about those scenarios.
What about this, Jay? When you clicked on the FX earlier, a number of predetermined calculations existed. What about the line S to store our own there, custom calculations? But then every time this matrix came up, we could reuse.
Yeah, so that's another alternative that we're thinking about. We're not really in favor of those, but yeah, that could be an option to kind of store that, because doing that would lead into all kinds of questions like, what's the store? What's the scope of the store? Can I now store that calculation and then my colleagues can reuse it? So is there an enterprise store? So that's like opening a whole box of Pandora that we're not entirely ready to do yet. So yeah, but it's definitely an option for us.
Yeah,
but right now, that doesn't exist. Right now, the story is copy paste, which is not great. I agree.
Thanks for the question.
Thanks for that, Jay. It looks really interesting, and I'm all in favour of things that make model creation easier. I'm often at the other end of the scale where I'm receiving these things and having to validate them, and now I'm in Power Query looking at what's being done there. I'm looking at calculated columns. I'm looking at measures. Now I've got another level of complexity with the visual calculations. What are your thoughts on, as these extra layers are added, how we can go about validating these early on reports?
So you're talking about calculated columns, custom columns, sorry, in Power Query.
I'm talking generally. It's really easy to create a nice shiny looking visual in Power BI. That's one of its strengths.
Sure.
Doesn't
Right.
mean numbers are always accurate.
Right.
And for me, receiving a report that someone's created on my behalf, I'm going to satisfy myself that those numbers are accurate. And this is another place for me to go and check and understand.
Right. Yes. So we've been thinking about this as well. So we are looking at two things. One is some way for the admin of the whole tenant to discover which visual calcs are being used, because I recognize that this would lead to shadow IT, where people build their own custom calculations, and maybe as an admin you want some ability to scan out what visual calcs people are using, so you could learn from that and basically elevate them to a measure and store them back into your central semantic model. So that's angle number one. That is not the exact angle you were talking about. You were talking about when you get a report from somebody, how do I tease out what has happened in this report? And so the other thing we're considering doing is adding a pane that allows you to discover visual calculations as well as measures and columns in this report. So then seeing, hey, you know, I see visual calc called profit being defined on this visual, and it's also on the other visual. Okay, so that's an interesting thing. Why is that being reused on two visuals? Why is that? Is that the same, or should that have been a measure? So we're thinking about adding that pane as well. As a way you open the report, you basically have like an inspector that shows you, okay, here's the visual calcs that are here. You can click on them. You will be taken to that definition right away in that visual.
Not to take away from what you're showing us, but that would be fantastic as well. Thanks.
Yep.
Thank you.
Cool. So
Right, it's almost the end of Jay's lunchtime. We have to go, right?
yeah, it's almost time. Also, I don't want to hold you longer than necessary. I recognize
one
it's
last quick question. Does anyone?
Yes.
Quick question. Anyone? Yes.
So the percent of so the percent of grand total now is in this sort of I guess place, and it used to be where you can just sort of drag it and then sort of show data as that. So is it permanently moved, or is it going to be two places?
So it will be permanently moved eventually. So I'm assuming you talk about, like, let me just do this. So you got either this option, which is basically a divide of a field by a collapse all. I haven't had time to show you all the functions, but collapse all is basically in a certain direction remove all details, right? So in this case, it would take, for example, if I take sales amount, collapse all would give me that number, because removing all details would basically give me the highest number, the grand total for that column, right? So that would be then the result of that collapse all. Now, so that's one way. That's Visual Calc's way. I'm assuming you refer to, whoopsie, what did I do? Oh, I broke it. Sorry. Let me go back. Of course, I didn't finish my calc, so that's why. Okay, let's go back. I'm assuming you're referring to this, where you could say, well, you know, I wanna have my my sales amount back. I'm just gonna add my sales amount because I'm not showing that here. So this will be very ugly, but that's okay. So now I can show value as percent of grand total. Is that what you're referring to?
Yeah.
Yeah. So we're essentially planning to replace that. So this entry point, as we say, so in the menu, it will still be there, but the thing that happens will be slightly differently. So because the problem with this is, if the percent of grand total doesn't necessarily do what you wanted it to do, there's no way for you to step in and go tweak it to exactly what you wanted. There's no way for you to get the DAX that we generated for this, right? We're all hiding that from you. So our plan is to keep this entry point, but then once you click on it, we generate a visual calc on your behalf that does that percent of grand total and add it to the visual, while hiding the original field on which you said, I want to show that as a grand total, right? So in this case, it would hide this Martin sales amount, add a new visual calc that performs that percent of grand total as you asked, but then in a visual calc, which would then allows you to go validate A, that that's the right expression, and B, it gives the right results. And if not, it allows you to then tweak that expression to do exactly what you wanted. Does that make sense?
See some nods, I think it does. Well, Jay, we'll let you go. Thank you very much for the time you've taken. I think she's perhaps one of the biggest improvements in Power BI in a few years that I can remember, at least. So I think people's minds are blown. Anyone in the room, if you share on social media, can get another slice of pizza. So can do that straight away. We will let you go, Jay. Thank you very much. And a round of applause for Jay.
Well, thank you all for having me. It was a pleasure. And yeah, stay tuned for the public preview. It's coming very soon, but I cannot tell you exactly when.
Yeah, we thought we had you. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye-bye.